Riley, when are you going to stop playing soldier and get a real career? My older brother Garrett said this loud enough for the entire anniversary party to hear. 37 family members, all dressed in their finest clothes, standing in the pristine backyard of my parents' estate in Millbrook Heights. Everyone turned to stare at me like I was some kind of circus act. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The question hung in the air like smoke from the expensive cigars the men were puffing on the marble patio. My sister-in-law, Victoria, actually snorted with laughter, nearly spilling her champagne on her designer dress. Even my own mother, Catherine Thornfield, shook her head with that familiar look of disappointment I'd grown so accustomed to over the years. Hi, I'm Riley Thornfield, and this is the story of how my family's golden anniversary became the night I finally showed them exactly who they've been underestimating for the past decade. Let me set the scene for you. We were celebrating my grandparents' 50th wedding anniversary at their mansion in Millbrook Heights, one of those old money neighborhoods where the houses have names instead of just addresses. The Thornfield family had gathered from across the country: doctors, lawyers, investment bankers, real estate moguls. Every single person in attendance was what you'd call traditionally successful. And then there was me, 28 years old, unmarried, no children, and according to my family, no real future prospects. While my cousins were discussing their latest stock portfolios and vacation homes, I was the one they whispered about in corners. Poor Riley, still trying to find herself. When is she going to grow up and settle down? Maybe she'll finally come to her senses soon. For 5 years, I'd been listening to these comments at every family gathering. 5 years of being treated like the family disappointment, the black sheep who just couldn't seem to get her act together. But tonight felt different. Tonight, something was about to change, and they had no idea what was coming. The Thornfield family hierarchy was crystal clear, and I was definitely at the bottom. At the top sat my grandfather, Theodore Thornfield, the patriarch who'd built a real estate empire from nothing. Below him, my father Harrison commanded respect as the city's most prominent cardiac surgeon. My brother Garrett had followed in Dad's footsteps, becoming an orthopedic surgeon with a practice that catered to professional athletes. He drove a midnight blue Maserati and lived in a penthouse downtown with his wife Victoria, who ran some exclusive interior design firm for the wealthy elite. Then there was my cousin Damien, the family's legal eagle, who'd made partner at the most prestigious law firm in the state before his 30th birthday. His sister Natasha had married into oil money and spent her days organizing charity galas and posting about her European shopping trips on social media. And me. According to them, I was the family charity case, the one who'd never quite figured out what she wanted to do with her life. The one who still lived in a modest apartment in Riverside District, drove a used Honda, and had mysterious jobs that nobody really understood or cared to ask about. This wasn't the first time I'd been publicly humiliated by my own family. It had become a tradition, really. At Christmas 3 years ago, Garrett had loudly wondered when I was going to stop living like a college student in front of all my cousins. Last Thanksgiving, Victoria had asked if I needed help finding a real job because her friend's company was hiring administrative assistants. My father would introduce me at professional events as my daughter Riley. She's still exploring her options. My mother would pat my hand sympathetically and suggest I consider going back to school for nursing or teaching, something stable and respectable for a woman. The pattern was always the same. They'd gather in their expensive clothes and their expensive houses, drinking their expensive wine, and somehow the conversation would always circle back to poor Riley and her lack of direction. They'd shake their heads with that mixture of pity and superiority that made my skin crawl. But I'd learned to smile and nod. I had learned to change the subject. I had learned to make myself small and unremarkable so that maybe, just maybe, they'd move on to discussing someone else's life choices. For 5 years, I'd perfected the art of being invisible at family gatherings. Tonight started no differently. I'd arrived at the anniversary party wearing a simple black dress, nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. I'd brought a modest gift and planned to stick to my usual strategy of blending into the background. But Garrett was in particularly fine form this evening. He'd had a few drinks, his latest surgery was featured in some medical journal, and he was feeling especially superior. When the family gathered for my grandfather's speech about legacy and achievement, Garrett decided it was the perfect moment to address the Riley situation once and for all. You know, Grandpa Theodore, you always talk about the importance of building something meaningful with your life. Maybe it's time someone had an honest conversation with Riley about her future. All eyes turned to me. The caterer stopped serving. The string quartet seemed to play more quietly. Even the children stopped running around the fountain to listen. You mean we're all here celebrating 50 years of marriage, 50 years of building something real and lasting. Meanwhile, Riley'd been drifting from one temporary thing to another for years. No husband, no children, no real career. My cousin Damien nodded sagely. It's not too late, though. Riley's still young enough to turn things around.
That's when Victoria decided to deliver the killing blow. She stepped forward, wine glass in hand, wearing that sickeningly sweet smile she reserved for moments when she wanted to seem caring while being absolutely vicious. "Riley, darling, I've been thinking," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "My friend Jennifer runs a very successful insurance agency. They're always looking for salespeople. It's not glamorous, but it's steady work. And honestly, at your age, maybe it's time to prioritize stability over whatever it is you've been doing." The crowd murmured their agreement. Several aunts nodded knowingly. My mother actually clasped her hands together like Victoria had just offered me salvation. But Victoria wasn't done. I mean, this whole phase you've been going through, living alone, these mysterious jobs you never want to talk about, no serious relationships, it's fine for someone in their early 20s. But Riley, you're nearly 30. When are you going to stop playing around and start building a real life? The silence that followed was deafening. 37 pairs of eyes were staring at me, waiting for my response. Some looked pitying, others looked impatient, a few looked genuinely concerned. And that's when I realized I was done. Done with the pity, done with the condescension, done with being treated like a failure by people who had no idea what I'd accomplished or what I'd sacrificed. Done with protecting their feelings at the expense of my own dignity. I set down my wine glass, straightened my shoulders, and looked each of them in the eye. You know what, Victoria? You're absolutely right. It is time for an honest conversation about my future. I smiled, and for the first time in 5 years, it wasn't the polite, accommodating smile I'd been practicing. It was something else entirely. In fact, I think it's time I told you all exactly what I've been doing with my life. But before I could say another word, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. The caller ID made my blood run cold. And suddenly this family drama seemed very, very small compared to what was about to happen. Because on the other end of that phone was someone who was about to change everything these people thought they knew about me. Someone who was about to reveal exactly who Riley Thornfield really was. And trust me, they weren't going to see it coming.
The silence was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop in that garden. 37 faces stared at me with expressions ranging from shock to disbelief to something that might have been awe. Garrett's mouth was hanging open. Victoria's wine glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the marble patio. My mother actually sat down hard on the nearest garden bench, looking like she might faint. "That's impossible," Damien finally managed. "Women can't be Navy SEALs." I smiled grimly. "Women couldn't be Navy SEALs until 2016, cousin. I was in the 3rd class to graduate. Top of my class, actually." My father stepped forward, his medical training kicking in as he tried to process this information logically. "Riley, if this is true, why didn't you tell us? Why let us think— Think what, Dad? That I was a failure? That I was wasting my life?" The anger I'd been suppressing for years finally had an outlet. Do you have any idea how many times I sat at these family dinners listening to you all discuss my lack of ambition while I was literally planning operations to rescue kidnapped diplomats? Aunt Patricia spoke up shakily. "But your apartment in Riverside District, your old car." Cover, Aunt Patricia. When you're a covert operative, you don't exactly advertise your success with luxury purchases. The modest lifestyle was deliberate. The mysterious jobs you all mocked, those were classified missions I couldn't discuss. The sound of helicopter rotors began to echo in the distance, growing louder by the second. "But you never said anything about the military," my mother whispered. "We had no idea." Because every time I tried to talk about my work, you changed the subject. Every time I mentioned traveling, you'd ask when I was going to settle down. You never asked what I was actually doing because you'd already decided I was the family disappointment. The helicopter was clearly visible now, a black military aircraft circling the mansion grounds. The sound was overwhelming, drowning out the string quartet and sending the catering staff scurrying for cover. My family members were all staring at the sky in shock, then back at me, trying to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with this revelation. "Riley, wait!" Garrett called out as I started walking toward the landing zone the pilot had identified. "If this is all true, if you're really what you say you are, why didn't you tell us? We're your family." I turned back to face them, my hair whipping around my face from the helicopter's downdraft. "Because family is supposed to support each other, Garrett. Family is supposed to believe in each other. You all spent 5 years making it clear that you thought I was a failure without ever once asking if maybe, just maybe, there was more to the story." Victoria spoke up shakily. "Riley, I'm sorry, we didn't know." "You didn't want to know," I shot back. "It was easier to have someone to look down on. It made you all feel better about your own choices to have the family screw up to point to." My grandfather Theodore approached, and for the first time in my life, I saw something like respect in his eyes. "Commander Thornfield," he said formally, "what can we do? How can we make this right?" The helicopter was landing now, and I could see my extraction team preparing to move. Time was up. You can start by understanding that success doesn't always look the way you expect it to. And maybe next time, before you decide someone is a failure, you might consider asking them about their life instead of just judging it. As I reached the helicopter, one of my team members jumped out. Staff Sergeant Martinez, a decorated soldier I'd served with in 3 different operations. He approached the stunned family group and snapped to attention. "Excuse me, folks. I'm here to extract Commander Thornfield. She's needed for a priority mission." My brother Garrett stepped forward, still looking shock-shacked. "Commander? She's really... What? What you say you are?" Martinez looked genuinely confused. "Sir, you don't know who she is? Commander Thornfield is one of the most decorated SEAL officers in the Navy. She saved more American lives than almost anyone in the service. We call her the Phantom because she can get in and out of impossible situations without leaving a trace." My cousin Natasha spoke up weakly. "But she drives a Honda." Martinez actually laughed. "Ma'am, with respect, Commander Thornfield could afford to buy this entire neighborhood. Her hazard pay alone from the past 5 years? Well, let's just say money isn't something she needs to worry about." The look on Victoria's face was priceless. The woman who just offered me a job selling insurance was realizing that I probably made more in a month than she made in a year. "But why the secrecy?" my father asked, his voice barely audible over the helicopter. Martinez glanced at me for permission, and I nodded. "Sir, when you're in Commander Thornfield's line of work, the fewer people who know your real identity, the safer everyone is, including family." I climbed into the helicopter but held up my hand to signal we needed 1 more minute. This conversation was 5 years overdue, and I was going to finish it. "Dad, remember when I told you I was taking a gap year after college to figure things out? That gap year was Navy SEAL training, the hardest military training in the world. 6 months of hell that broke most of the men who tried it." My mother was crying now. "Riley, why didn't you—"
"Because you would have tried to talk me out of it, Mom. You would have said it was too dangerous, too unconventional, too unladylike. You would have worried yourself sick and probably tried to convince me to become a nurse instead." I looked at each of them in turn. Every time I disappeared for work, I was on a mission. Somalia, Afghanistan, Syria, the Philippines. Every time you complained about my lack of stability, I was literally keeping America stable. Every time you wondered when I'd find direction in my life, I was directing operations that saved lives. Garrett was shaking his head slowly. "The times you came back injured, you said you'd been hiking or rock climbing." "Shrapnel wounds, Garrett. Bullet grazes. The kind of injuries you get when you're extracting hostages from terrorist compounds."
The pilot tapped his watch, indicating we needed to move. I looked at my family one last time. I love you all, but I've spent 5 years protecting your feelings while you destroyed mine. I've kept quiet about my service to keep you safe, and you've repaid that sacrifice by treating me like a disappointment. That ends tonight. As the helicopter began to lift off, I saw my family standing in their formal clothes in the garden, staring up at us with expressions of shock, awe, and what might have been the beginning of pride. It was about time. The mission in the South Pacific lasted 4 days. 4 days of radio silence while my family processed what they'd learned at the anniversary party. When I finally returned to Norfolk Naval Base, my phone had 47 missed calls and 83 text messages from various family members. The messages told a story of their own. The first wave, sent within hours of my extraction, were frantic apologies mixed with disbelief. Garrett had texted, "Riley, call me back. We need to talk. I can't believe we didn't know." Victoria's message was shorter, but telling. "I feel sick about what I said. Please forgive me." But as the days passed and news reports began mentioning a successful covert operation in the Pacific Theater, the tone of their messages shifted. Suddenly, everyone wanted to be part of my story. Cousin Damien sent 3 paragraphs about how he'd always known there was something special about me. Aunt Patricia wrote about how proud the family was of my service. The most revealing message came from my mother. "Riley, your father and I have been talking to a reporter from the Herald Tribune. They want to do a story about our war hero daughter. Call us back so we can coordinate what to tell them." I stared at that message for a long time. After 5 years of treating me like an embarrassment, they now wanted to parade me around like a trophy they'd discovered in the attic. They wanted to manage my story, control the narrative, and somehow make themselves look good in the process. That's when I realized they still didn't get it. They still thought this was about them. I called my grandfather first. Of all of them, Theodore had shown the most genuine respect during those final moments before my extraction. When he answered, his voice was subdued. "Riley, thank God you're safe. We've been worried sick." "Have you, Grandpa? Or have you been worried about how this reflects on the family?" There was a long pause. "Both, I suppose. I won't lie to you." At least he was honest. "Grandpa, I need you to listen carefully. I'm going to tell you exactly how this is going to work going forward." The family meeting I called took place at my grandfather's house 3 days later. But this time, it wasn't in the garden where they'd humiliated me. This time, I chose the boardroom where Theodore conducted his business deals. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. They filled in looking nervous and contrite. Gone were the smug expressions and condescending smiles. Victoria had clearly been crying. Garrett couldn't make eye contact. My parents sat together holding hands like they were facing a tribunal, which, in a way, they were. I entered the room in my dress blues. Every medal and commendation I'd earned displayed on my chest. The Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, the Navy Cross. 23 individual decorations that told the story of 5 years they'd completely ignored. The transformation in their demeanor was immediate. Garrett actually stood up when I entered, an unconscious show of respect he'd never displayed before. My father's eyes went wide as he took in the full display of my achievements. "Please, sit down," I said, taking my place at the head of the table where Theodore usually sat. He'd yielded the position without question. "I want to start by addressing the elephant in the room. Several of you have been contacted by reporters wanting to do stories about the family that raised a Navy SEAL. You've been telling them how proud you've always been, how you always knew I was destined for greatness." Victoria shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Damien studied his hands. "Those interviews end now. If any reporter contacts you about me, you will refer them to the Navy's Public Affairs Office. You will not speak for me, about me, or on my behalf. You lost that privilege when you spent 5 years treating me like a charity case." My mother started to protest. "Riley, we're your family." "Are you, Mom? Because family members support each other. Family members believe in each other. Family members don't publicly humiliate each other at anniversary parties." I pulled out a folder and placed it on the table. These are copies of performance evaluations from my commanding officers, letters of commendation from the Pentagon, mission reports I'm authorized to share. I want you to read them because I want you to understand exactly what you were mocking all these years.
Garrett reached for the folder with shaking hands. As he read, his face went pale. Riley, it says here you were personally commended by the Secretary of Defense for... Jesus Christ, you saved an entire embassy? 3 embassies, actually. But who's counting? The weeks that followed established a new family dynamic. Gone were the casual insults and condescending advice. When I attended my cousin's wedding a month later, the introductions were very different. "This is my daughter Riley," my father told his colleagues. "She's a Navy SEAL commander. No qualifications, no apologetic explanations, just simple pride." Victoria approached me at the reception, visibly nervous. "Riley, I owe you an apology that goes beyond anything I can say. The job offer, the comments about your age, everything I said, I was so far out of line." I studied her face, looking for sincerity. "Victoria, the truth is, you were reflecting exactly what this family taught you to think about me. You weren't the problem. You were just the symptom. Is there anything I can do to make it right?" I smiled. "Yes. The next time someone in this family treats someone else like a failure, speak up. Use your voice to defend instead of attack." The real test came when Garrett's medical colleagues started asking about his war hero sister. I watched him navigate those conversations, seeing whether he'd try to take credit for my success or honestly admit his past mistakes. "I'm proud of Riley now," I overheard him tell Dr. Phillips from the hospital. "But I'll be honest, we failed her as a family for years. We were so focused on traditional markers of success that we completely missed what real service and sacrifice looked like." That conversation told me everything I needed to know about whether he'd actually learned something. The biggest change came from my grandfather. Theodore called me to his office 6 weeks after the anniversary party, the same boardroom where I'd laid down my new rules. "Riley, I want to offer you a position in the company, Senior Vice President, with a focus on security and risk management. The salary would be..." "Grandpa, stop." I held up my hand. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not done serving my country." He nodded slowly. "I figured as much. But the offer stands, whenever you're ready. And, Riley, I want you to know that boardroom you commandeered last month, I'm having a plaque made for that chair. Commander Riley Thornfield's seat. Because you earned the right to sit at the head of this family's table." 3 months later, I received orders for my next deployment. As I prepared to leave, my family gathered at the airport to see me off. But this time, there were no questions about when I was coming home, no suggestions about alternative career paths, no comments about my single status. This time, my mother hugged me and whispered, "Stay safe, honey. We'll be here when you get back." Garrett shook my hand formally. "Give 'em hell, Commander." And Victoria, the woman who'd once offered me a job selling insurance, pressed a small gift into my hands. Inside was a bracelet with a simple inscription: "To the strongest woman I know. Thank you for showing me what real success looks like." As I boarded the plane for my next classified destination, I realized something had fundamentally shifted. I no longer needed their approval or validation, but for the first time in years, I actually had it. And that made all the difference. If you've ever been underestimated by the people who should have believed in you most, you know how this story ends isn't really an ending at all. It's a beginning where you finally stop shrinking yourself to fit other people's limited expectations and start living as large as your actual accomplishments deserve. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving them wrong. It's reaching the point where their opinion of you simply doesn't matter anymore. But when they finally see you clearly, well, that's just a nice bonus. The real success was always yours. They just finally learned how to recognize it. 6 months after my deployment ended,
I returned to find that my revelation had created ripple effects I never anticipated. The Thornfield family had become something of a local legend in Millbrook Heights. Word had spread through their social circles about the secret Navy SEAL who'd been hiding in plain sight, and suddenly everyone wanted to know how they'd missed such an extraordinary person in their midst. But the real changes were happening behind closed doors, and they weren't all positive. I discovered this when my cousin Natasha called me 3 weeks after my return, her voice tight with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "Riley, we need to talk. Can you meet me somewhere private, not at the family house, not anywhere they might see us?" We met at a small cafe in downtown Riverside District, far from the polished establishments where the Thornfield family usually conducted their business. Natasha looked different, thinner, tired, and dark circles under her eyes that expensive concealer couldn't quite hide. "I need to tell you something," she began without preamble, "about why everyone was so quick to dismiss you all these years. It wasn't just about traditional success or family expectations." I set down my coffee cup, sensing this conversation was about to take a serious turn. "What do you mean?" Natasha glanced around the cafe nervously, then leaned forward. "It was deliberate, Riley. The constant criticism, the way they made you feel small, the jokes about your career choices, it wasn't accidental." My blood went cold. "Explain." "Do you remember when you first graduated from college, when you told everyone you were taking that gap year to figure out things?" I nodded. Of course I remembered. It was when I'd secretly enlisted and begun SEAL training, but I'd told the family I was just taking time to explore my options.
Uncle Harrison and Aunt Catherine were terrified, Natasha continued, not because they thought you were directionless, but because they thought you were too driven, too independent. They were afraid you'd outshine everyone else in the family. The words hit me like a physical blow. What are you talking about? Riley, you were valedictorian of your high school class. You graduated summa cum laude from Princeton with a double major in international relations and military history. You spoke 4 languages fluently and had already been contacted by government recruiters. Everyone knew you were exceptional. I stared at her, trying to process this information. But they always acted like I was underachieving. Because they wanted you to think that. They were scared that if you realized your full potential, you'd make the rest of us look ordinary by comparison. Natasha pulled out her phone and showed me a series of text messages. These are from a family group chat you were never added to. Look at the dates. They go back 5 years. The messages were devastating. Screenshots of conversations where my family members strategized about how to keep Riley humble and prevent her from getting too big for her britches. Messages where they laughed about their successful campaign to make me doubt myself. One message from Victoria stood out. Another family dinner where we convinced Riley she's not living up to her potential. She looked so deflated when she left. Mission accomplished. Another from Garrett. Riley mentioned something about a new job opportunity today. I made sure to tell her it sounded unstable and risky. She's backing down from it now. But the worst were from my own parents. My father had written, "We can't let Riley get too confident. She's already too smart for her own good. If she realizes how capable she actually is, she might leave us all behind." My mother's response, "Don't worry, as long as we keep emphasizing her failures and questioning her choices, she'll stay insecure enough to keep coming back for our approval." I felt sick. 5 years of psychological manipulation, 5 years of deliberately crushing my confidence while I was secretly succeeding beyond their wildest dreams. "Natasha, why are you showing me this now?" Her eyes filled with tears. "Because I was part of it, Riley. We all were. And watching you at that anniversary party is seeing you stand up for yourself, seeing what you'd actually accomplished. I realized we weren't just wrong. We were cruel. We systematically destroyed your self-esteem because we were jealous of your potential." She wiped her eyes with a napkin. "But there's more.
After your extraction that night, after we learned who you really were, some family members started trying to capitalize on your success. Uncle Damien has been using your name to get military contract work for his law firm. Aunt Patricia has been name-dropping you at her charity events to seem more important. And Garrett? What about Garrett? He's been telling people at the hospital that he inspired you to join the military, that his medical expertise helped guide your tactical training. He's taking credit for your success while simultaneously trying to minimize it. The betrayal cut deep, but it also clarified something I'd been struggling with since my return. The family's newfound respect hadn't been genuine growth. It had been another form of manipulation. There's something else, Natasha continued, the real reason I wanted to meet with you. I'm leaving. Leaving what? All of it. The family business, the social circle, the whole toxic system we've built around tearing each other down to feel better about ourselves. My husband knows about the messages. He's as disgusted as I am. We're moving to Colorado, starting over. She reached across the table and grabbed my hand. Riley, I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I participated in hurting you for years, but I need you to know that seeing your strength, watching you succeed despite everything we did to sabotage your success, it opened my eyes to who I'd become. I sat in silence for several minutes, processing everything she'd told me. The systematic nature of their campaign against my confidence was almost impressive in its cruelty, but it also explained so much about my own internal struggles over the years. Natasha, can you send me copies of those messages? Already done. I forwarded everything to your email before I came here. Why? Because you deserve to know the truth. And because the rest of them are planning another family gathering next month for Uncle Theodore's birthday. They're expecting you to come and play the role of the grateful, reformed family member who's finally found her way. She stood up, shouldering her purse. But now you know what they really think of you. Now you know it was never about love or concern, it was about control. As she walked away, I sat in that little cafe, staring at my phone, scrolling through 5 years of messages where my family had systematically plotted to undermine my confidence and sabotage my success. Messages where they celebrated every time they managed to make me feel small. The military had taught me about enemy tactics and psychological warfare, but I'd never imagined that the enemy might be sitting around my grandmother's dining room, carving turkey and passing the hatred. For the first time since my extraction from that anniversary party, I felt something more powerful than vindication. I felt clarity. They hadn't just failed to recognize my success, they had actively worked to prevent it. The fact that I had succeeded anyway, that I'd become everything they tried to stop me from becoming, wasn't just a victory. It was a testament to a strength they spent 5 years trying to break and never even cracked. And now I had to decide what to do with that knowledge.
The birthday party Natasha had mentioned was 3 weeks away. Grandfather Theodore was turning 80, and the entire extended family would be there. They were expecting the reformed Riley, the grateful daughter who'd finally found her place in the family hierarchy. But they were going to get someone very different. They were going to get someone who knew exactly what they'd been doing all along. And this time, I wasn't just going to defend myself. I was going to go on the offensive. I spent 2 weeks preparing for Theodore's birthday party, like it was a military operation, because in many ways, it was. The evidence Natasha had provided was comprehensive. 5 years of documented psychological warfare disguised as family concern. But evidence alone wasn't enough. I needed intelligence, strategy, and perfect timing. The military had taught me that the best victories come not from brute force, but from superior information and flawless execution. My first call was to Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, a Navy intelligence officer I'd worked with on 3 separate operations. If anyone could help me conduct background research on my own family, it was Chen. Commander Thornfield, this is an unusual request, she said after I'd explained what I needed. You want me to run financial and legal background checks on your relatives? Sarah, I need to know what leverage points exist. These people have been running a psychological operation against me for years. I need to understand their vulnerabilities before I engage. There was a pause. I can't use Navy resources for personal matters, but I know some private investigators who owe me favors. Give me a week. While Chen worked her contacts, I reached out to another resource, Dr. Marcus Webb, a military psychologist who'd consulted on interrogation techniques. I needed to understand the psychological profile I was dealing with. What you're describing is textbook narcissistic family dynamics, Dr. Webb explained during our video call. The systematic undermining of one member to maintain group cohesion and individual superiority. It's actually quite sophisticated from a psychological manipulation standpoint. How do I counter it? I asked. The most effective approach is controlled exposure of their tactics, preferably in a public setting where their social image is at stake. Narcissists can't tolerate being exposed, especially in front of people whose opinions they value. Any specific techniques you'd recommend? Dr. Webb smiled grimly. Ever heard of the Socratic method? Ask questions that force them to explain their own behavior. Let them hang themselves with their own words. The intelligence Chen's context provided was illuminating. Garrett's medical practice was under investigation by the state medical board for insurance fraud. Victoria's interior design business was failing, with 3 major clients suing for breach of contract. Damien's law firm was hemorrhaging partners after a sexual harassment scandal involving one of his associates. Even my parents were struggling. My father's surgical privileges had been suspended pending a malpractice review. The only family members with stable situations were my grandfather Theodore and, ironically, myself. But the most interesting discovery was about the family trust Theodore had established years ago. According to the documents Chen's contact had obtained, Theodore's will included a character clause. Family members who brought dishonor to the Thornfield name could be removed from inheritance consideration. The clause had been added 3 years ago, around the time my military service had begun, but before anyone knew about it. Now I understood another layer of their motivation. They hadn't just been threatened by my potential success. They'd been actively protecting their financial interests by ensuring I remained the family disappointment. But Theodore didn't know about their systematic campaign against me, and he definitely didn't know about their current attempts to exploit my military service for their own benefit. Armed with this information, I began planning my approach for the birthday party. This wouldn't be an angry confrontation or an emotional outburst. This would be a surgical strike, precise and devastating. I arrived at Theodore's estate exactly 30 minutes after the party had begun, late enough that everyone would be settled and comfortable, early enough that I wouldn't miss the key moments. I wore my dress blues again, but this time I'd added something new, a small recording device, perfectly legal in our state's single-party consent jurisdiction. The family was gathered in the main living room, the same space where they'd spent years making me feel inadequate. But tonight, the dynamic was different. When I entered, conversations stopped. People stood up. The respect was immediate and visible. "Riley," my mother called out, mushing over to embrace me. "We're so glad you could make it. We were just telling the Hendersons about your latest mission." I smiled politely. "Actually, Mom, I can't discuss classified operations, but I'd love to hear what you've been telling people about my career." The question seemed innocent enough, but I watched my mother's face carefully. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her features. "Well, just how proud we are, of course. How we always knew you were destined for great things." "Always knew?" I repeated, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "That's interesting. I was under the impression that you were concerned about my lack of direction for several years." Garrett approached, drink in hand, clearly trying to steer the conversation away from dangerous territory. "Riley, we should introduce you to Judge Morrison. He's very interested in military service." But I wasn't ready to be diverted. "Actually, Garrett, I think it would be more interesting to tell Judge Morrison about our family's views on military service. Didn't you once say that people who join the military are just looking for structure because they can't succeed in civilian life?"
The room went quiet. Garrett's face went pale. I don't remember saying that. Really? Because I have a very good memory for conversations about career choices. In fact, I remember a lot of specific comments about my potential and my decisions.
Victoria approached nervously, sensing the shift in tension. Riley, maybe we should focus on celebrating Grandpa Theodore tonight. This is his special day. You're absolutely right, Victoria. Family occasions should be about honesty and love, shouldn't they? Not about manipulation or undermining each other. Theodore himself stepped forward, his business instincts alert to the undercurrents in the room. Riley, is there something specific you'd like to discuss? This was the moment I'd been preparing for. I reached into my purse and pulled out a printed copy of some of the text messages Natasha had shared. Actually, Grandpa, there is. I recently learned some interesting information about family communication patterns over the past 5 years. Apparently, there were discussions about my career and personal life that I wasn't privy to. I held up the papers, watching as recognition dawned on several faces. Damien actually took a step backward. These are text messages from a family group chat I was never included in. Messages where family members discussed strategies for undermining my confidence and sabotaging my career prospects. Would you like me to read some of them aloud? The silence in the room was deafening. Even the catering staff had stopped moving. For instance, here's one from last Christmas, where someone wrote, "Riley seemed too confident about that job interview. Made sure to mention how unstable that type of work usually is. She's second-guessing herself now." I looked around the room, making eye contact with each family member. Or this one, from my birthday 2 years ago, "Successfully convinced Riley that her lifestyle choices were immature. She looked crushed when she left. Good work, team." My grandfather's face had gone stone cold. In 40 years of building his business empire, he'd developed a legendary ability to read people and situations. He was reading this one perfectly. "Riley, are you telling me that members of this family deliberately sabotaged your confidence and career prospects?" "I'm not telling you, Grandpa, I'm showing you. Documentation, timestamps, participants, a coordinated campaign that lasted 5 years. Garrett tried to interrupt. "Riley, you're taking those messages out of context." "Am I?" I pulled out my phone and opened the voice recording app, making sure everyone could see it. "Then please, explain the context to me. Explain to everyone here, including Judge Morrison and the Hendersons, why my family spent 5 years systematically trying to destroy my self-esteem." "We were trying to help you," Victoria burst out. "We were worried about you making bad decisions." "By lying to me about my capabilities? By telling me I was underachieving when you knew I was valedictorian of my high school class and summa cum laude from Princeton?" The gasps from the non-family guests were audible. Clearly, my academic achievements had never been part of the family's public narrative about me. By convincing me I was directionless when government recruiters had been contacting me since my junior year of college? My father stepped forward, his face flushed. "Riley, we can discuss this privately." "No, Dad, we've had enough private discussions. This family's pattern of psychological manipulation ends tonight, and it ends publicly because that's the only thing that seems to matter to any of you, your public image." I turned to face the entire room, guests and family members alike. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to understand something about the family you're celebrating tonight. While they've been telling you how proud they are of their Navy SEAL daughter, they spent 5 years actively trying to prevent me from becoming successful. They knew exactly how capable I was, and they systematically worked to convince me otherwise.
The silence in the room was completely silent except for the sound of my grandfather slowly setting down his drink. But here's what they didn't count on. Military training doesn't just teach you tactics and strategy. It teaches you resilience. It teaches you to succeed despite the odds, despite the obstacles, despite the enemies. I looked directly at my parents, even when those enemies are sitting at your own dinner table. The silence that followed my revelation stretched for what felt like an eternity. Theodore Thornfield stood motionless in his living room, his pale blue eyes moving systematically from one family member to another. At 80 years old, he'd built his fortune by reading people's character, and I could see him reassessing every person in the room. Judge Morrison cleared his throat awkwardly. Perhaps we should give the family some privacy. No. Theodore's voice cut through the room like a blade. Stay. All of you. I want witnesses to what happens next. He walked to his desk in the corner of the room and pulled out a leather-bound folder, the same folder he'd used to sign business deals worth millions of dollars. His hands shook slightly as he opened it, but his voice remained steady. Riley, show me those messages. I handed him the printed copies, watching as his weathered fingers traced the words his own children and grandchildren had written about me. With each message he read, his jaw grew tighter. When he reached Victoria's comment about mission accomplished, after making me feel deflated, I saw his knuckles go white. Harrison, my father's name came out like a command from a military officer, step forward. My father approached hesitantly, his face ashen. I'd never seen him look so small. You wrote this message. We can't let Riley get too confident. She's already too smart for her own good love. If she realizes how capable she actually is, she might leave us all behind. Is that accurate? Dad, I can explain. Is that accurate? Theodore's voice rose a little, cutting off any excuse. Yes, but... Catherine. My mother stepped forward like she was approaching a firing squad. You responded to Harrison's message with, "Don't worry, as long as we keep emphasizing her failures and questioning her choices, she'll stay insecure enough to keep coming back for our approval." Did you write that?
My mother was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks. Theodore, we were protecting her. From what? From success? From confidence? From becoming the extraordinary woman she clearly already was? He turned to face the entire family. For 50 years, I've built this family's reputation on the principle that we support each other's excellence, that we lift each other up, that the Thornfield name means something because we stand together. His voice grew stronger with each word. What I'm learning tonight is that while I was building that reputation, you were systematically destroying one of your own, not just ignoring her achievements, but actively sabotaging them. Garrett stepped forward desperately. Grandpa, you don't understand. Riley was always so independent, so sure of herself. We thought... You thought what? That independence was a character flaw? That confidence needed to be broken? Theodore's business mask was completely gone now, replaced by raw anger I'd never seen from him. She was 19 years old when she graduated summa cum laude from Princeton. 19! Do you understand how exceptional that is? And instead of celebrating her brilliance, you spent the next decade convincing her she was a failure? He pulled out another document from his folder. Judge Morrison, you're here as my legal counsel as well as my friend. I want this witnessed and documented. The judge nodded solemnly, pulling out his own papers. 3 years ago, I established a character clause in my will. Any family member who brings dishonor to the Thornfield name would forfeit their inheritance. I did this because I believed in the importance of integrity and family loyalty. Theodore looked directly at my parents. I never imagined the dishonor would come from systematic psychological abuse of one of your own children. Theodore, please, my mother began. I'm not finished.
His voice was ice cold. Damien, you've been using Riley's military service to obtain government contracts for your law firm. Contracts worth over $2 million obtained by claiming family connection to a decorated war hero. The same war hero you helped convince was a failure. Damien's face went completely white. I saw him glance toward the door, calculating whether he could escape. Garrett, you've been telling colleagues at the hospital that you inspired Riley's military career, that your medical expertise contributed to her tactical training. You've been taking credit for achievements you actively tried to prevent. That's not... I never meant... Garrett stammered. Victoria, your business is failing because you've lost 3 major clients due to incompetence and breach of contract. But you've been telling potential new clients that you're the sister-in-law of a Navy SEAL commander? Using Riley's reputation to rehabilitate your own? Victoria was gripping her husband's arm so tightly her knuckles were white. Theodore turned to address the room's guests. Ladies and gentlemen, you came here tonight to celebrate my 80th birthday. Instead, you've witnessed something I never thought possible in my family. The systematic emotional abuse of a child who grew up to become more successful than any of us ever dreamed. He walked back to his desk and pulled out a pen. Judge Morrison, I'm making changes to my will tonight, effective immediately. Theodore, you can't... I can do whatever I want with my own money, Harrison. And what I want is to ensure that the only family member who actually embodies the values I've tried to instill gets what she deserves. He began writing on official documents. Riley, you are now the primary beneficiary of the Thornfield Family Trust. The real estate holdings, the investment portfolio, the controlling interest in Thornfield Enterprises, all of it. The room erupted in shocked voices. Dad, you can't do this. She doesn't even want the business. This isn't fair. Fair? Theodore's voice cut through the chaos. What's fair is that the person who succeeded despite deliberate sabotage gets rewarded for that success. What's fair is that the people who tried to destroy her confidence face consequences for their actions. He continued writing, Furthermore, Harrison and Catherine, your access to the family trust is revoked immediately. The credit lines, the expense accounts, the properties, all closed as of tonight. My mother collapsed into a chair, sobbing. My father looked like he might have a heart attack. Garrett, Damien, Victoria, you have 30 days to cease using Riley's name and military service for your professional benefit. Any continued exploitation will result in legal action for fraud and misrepresentation. Theodore signed the final document with a flourish and handed it to Judge Morrison for witnessing. But most importantly, he continued, looking directly at me, Riley, I want you to understand something. Your success was never about this family's support or lack thereof. You succeeded because you have something none of the rest of us have. True strength of character. He walked over to me and placed his hands on my shoulders. You became a Navy SEAL not despite your family's sabotage, but because you had the resilience to overcome it. You saved lives not because we encouraged you, but because you had the courage to act when others couldn't. You earned every medal, every commendation, every promotion through your own merit. Tears were running down my face now, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of validation from the one family member whose opinion I'd always secretly craved. I'm proud of you, Riley. Not proud because you're my granddaughter, but proud because you're the kind of person I've spent my entire life trying to become. He turned back to face the rest of the family. As for the rest of you, you have a choice. You can spend the next 30 days reflecting on your behavior and making genuine amends for the psychological damage you've inflicted, or you can continue the pattern of manipulation and selfishness that got you here.
But understand this.
Riley owes you nothing. Not her forgiveness, not her presence at family gatherings, not her continued tolerance of your behavior. She's given this family far more grace than any of you deserved. The room was completely silent except for the sound of my mother's crying and the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. "This party is over," Theodore announced. "Everyone except Riley needs to leave. Now." As my family members filed out in shocked silence, each one avoiding eye contact with me, I realized that everything had changed. Not just my inheritance or my standing in the family, but my understanding of my own worth. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't need their approval, because I finally had something better. The recognition that I'd never needed it in the first place. After the last family member had left Theodore's house in stunned silence, I found myself alone with my grandfather in his study. The weight of what had just transpired settled over us like dust after an explosion. Theodore poured himself a glass of aged whiskey and offered me one, which I accepted gratefully. 80 years old, he said quietly, settling into his leather chair, and I'm still learning things about my own family that make me sick to my stomach. I sipped the whiskey, feeling its warmth cut through the adrenaline that had been sustaining me all evening. "Grandpa, I need you to understand something. I never wanted your money or the business. That was never what this was about." He studied me with those sharp blue eyes that had intimidated business rivals for decades. "I know that, Riley. That's exactly why you're the only one who deserves it." "But I have a military career. I can't run Thornfield Enterprises from overseas deployments." Theodore smiled for the first time all evening. "You think I built a multi-million-dollar company by micromanaging every detail? The business runs itself with good people in key positions. What it needs is someone at the top who understands real leadership, real integrity, someone who's proven they can make life-or-death decisions under pressure." He pulled out a business portfolio from his desk. "Besides, I've been watching your approach to tonight's confrontation. You gathered intelligence, analyzed weaknesses, formed strategic alliances, executed a plan with precision timing, and achieved total victory with minimal collateral damage. That's not just military training, Riley. That's natural executive ability." The compliment hit me harder than I had expected. For so many years, I'd compartmentalized my military achievements and my family relationships, never imagining they could intersect causatively. "There's something else we need to discuss," Theodore continued. "The fallout from tonight is going to be significant. Your parents will likely try to contest the will changes. Garrett and Damien might attempt legal challenges. And Victoria," he paused, Victoria is going to be desperate." As if summoned by his words, the house phone rang. Theodore glanced at the caller ID and handed me the receiver. "It's your mother. This should be interesting." I answered cautiously. "Hello, Mom?" "Riley, thank God you're still there." Her voice was shaky, clearly having been crying for the past hour. "We need to talk. My father and we're at the Grandview Hotel downtown. We can't go home." "What do you mean you can't go home?" "The credit cards aren't working. The house account is frozen. Riley, we don't even have access to cash for gas to get home." I looked at Theodore, who was listening to every word. He nodded grimly. When he made business decisions, he implemented them immediately and thoroughly. "Mom, Grandpa explained the consequences of your actions quite clearly. You systematically undermined my confidence for 5 years. Those actions have financial ramifications." "But we're your parents. You can't just abandon us. We made mistakes, yes, but we love you." The word love hung in the air like a challenge. I'd spent years questioning whether their treatment of me was compatible with love, and now I had documentary evidence that it wasn't. "Mom, if you loved me, you wouldn't have celebrated in text messages every time you successfully made me doubt myself. If you loved me, you wouldn't have sabotaged job opportunities or convinced me I was underachieving when you knew I was exceptional." "We were scared, Riley. We were scared you'd leave us behind, scared you'd realize we weren't good enough for you." For the first time, I heard something approaching honesty in her voice, but it was too little too late. So instead of dealing with your own insecurities, you decided to destroy mine. That's not love, Mom. That's psychological abuse. Please, honey, we'll do anything. We'll go to counseling, we'll make public apologies, whatever you want. Just don't let us lose everything. I found myself thinking about my SEAL training, specifically with lessons about negotiation with hostile forces. You never make deals from a position of desperation, and you never reward behavior you want to stop. Mom, here's what's going to happen. You and Dad are going to check out of that hotel and drive home in whatever car you can afford with your own money, not family trust money. You're going to face the reality of living within your actual means, the way I've been doing my entire adult life. But the house, the cars, the country club membership are luxuries you were funding through a trust that belongs to someone you spent 5 years psychologically abusing. Did you really think there would never be consequences? I heard her crying again, but this time it didn't trigger my old instincts to comfort her. Instead, I felt the cold satisfaction of justice being served. Riley, what about family loyalty? What about forgiveness? What about it? Where was family loyalty when you were plotting against my self-esteem? Where was forgiveness when I made normal young adult mistakes and you used them as ammunition to convince me I was a failure?
Theodore made a gesture indicating I should wrap up the call. Mom, I'm going to hang up now. When you're ready to have a real conversation about accountability and making amends, not just when you're financially desperate, you can contact me. But understand that your relationship with me will never again be based on my need for your approval. I hung up without waiting for her response. Theodore nodded approvingly. That was well handled, but this is just the beginning. Tomorrow, they'll start making rounds to other family members, trying to build alliances against you. They'll paint you as vindictive and ungrateful. Let 'em. I have something they don't. Documented evidence of their systematic manipulation and a clear conscience about my own actions. Good. But there's someone else you need to prepare for. I suspect Natasha will be calling you soon. As if on cue, my cell phone buzzed with a text from Natasha. Riley, I'm at the airport. Flying back from Denver tonight. Need to see you tomorrow, something important. I showed Theodore the message. He frowned. She's the one who gave you the evidence about the group chat, correct? Yes, she seemed genuinely remorseful. Maybe, or maybe she's positioning herself as your ally now that the family power structure has shifted. Be careful, Riley. People who participated in psychological manipulation for 5 years don't suddenly develop consciences overnight. His warning resonated with my military training. In covert operations, you learned quickly that people's motivations often had multiple layers, and recent converts to your cause were sometimes the least trustworthy. Grandpa, can I ask you something? Why didn't you see what was happening? You're incredibly perceptive in business. Theodore was quiet for a long moment, swirling his whiskey. Because I made the mistake of trusting that parents would naturally want the best for their children. I assumed that any family dysfunction was normal sibling rivalry or generational differences. I never imagined deliberate sabotage. He looked up at me with something approaching shame in his eyes. And because I was so focused on building wealth and status for the family, that I forgot to pay attention to whether we were building character. Tonight was a wake-up call about the kind of people my money has enabled them to become. It's not your fault, Grandpa. Isn't it? I created a system where financial security was tied to family approval. I gave them tools to use against you, even if I didn't intend for them to be used that way. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, both processing the magnitude of the evening's revelations. Finally, Theodore spoke again. Riley, there's one more thing. I've arranged for additional security for you, starting tomorrow. When you dramatically shift family power dynamics involving this much money, people sometimes make desperate decisions. You think they'd actually try to hurt me? I think desperate people do unpredictable things, and your family just became very desperate. As I drove home that night, I realized that my military training had prepared me for this in ways I'd never anticipated. I'd learned to identify threats, analyze motivations, and respond strategically to hostile actions. What I hadn't expected was that I'd need to use those skills against my own family. But as the city lights blurred past my windows, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Complete clarity about who I was and what I deserved. The psychological fog they'd maintained around my self-worth had finally lifted. And for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't afraid of what came next. 18 months later, I stood in the boardroom of Thornfield Enterprises, looking out from the city skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. The view was different from this height. You could see patterns and connections that were invisible from ground level. It was a fitting metaphor for how my perspective on everything had changed. The meeting I was about to chair would determine the future direction of a company worth $340 million. 6 months earlier, I'd completed my final Navy deployment and transitioned to reserve status, allowing me to take active control of the business Theodore had entrusted to me. The transition had been smoother than anyone expected, largely because the company's senior management had been hungry for real leadership after years of Theodore's increasingly hands-off approach. My assistant knocked and entered. "Commander Thornfield, the board members are assembled. Are you ready?" I smiled at the title. Even in civilian business, my military rank had followed me. It wasn't pretension. It was respect, something I'd finally learned to accept as my due. "Send them in, Janet." The boardroom filled with the 12 senior executives who ran various divisions of Thornfield Enterprises. Unlike family meetings, these people judged success by concrete metrics: profit margins, market share, strategic growth. They didn't care about my personal life or marital status. They cared about results. And the results had been exceptional. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, activating the presentation screen, "I'm pleased to report that our third quarter earnings exceeded projections by 23%. Our new government contracting division, leveraging relationships I developed during my military service, has secured $89 million in federal infrastructure projects." The applause was genuine. These people had initially been skeptical about a 29-year-old military officer taking over their company, but numbers didn't lie. Under my leadership, Thornfield Enterprises was having its most profitable year in company history. More importantly, our employee satisfaction ratings have increased 41% since we implemented the leadership accountability programs I developed based on military training principles. Turnover is at an all-time low, and productivity is at an all-time high. I clicked to the next slide showing expansion plans, which brings us to our major announcement. Thornfield Enterprises will be opening offices in San Diego and Norfolk, positioned to support our growing defense contracting work. We're also launching a veteran employment initiative, partnering with companies nationwide to place transitioning service members in leadership roles.
The room buzzed with excitement. These weren't just business ventures. They were personal missions that combined my military background with my new civilian authority. After the meeting, I walked to Theodore's old office, which I'd converted into a more functional workspace. Gone were the hunting trophies and intimidating mahogany furniture. In their place were clean lines, advanced technology, and photos from my military service alongside pictures of successful company projects. Theodore himself was waiting for me, seated in one of the modern chairs I'd installed. At 81, he moved more slowly than before, but his mind remained sharp. He'd become something between a mentor and a proud grandfather, watching my transformation with obvious satisfaction. "Excellent presentation, Riley. The board is completely won over." "They should be. We're making them rich while doing meaningful work." He chuckled. "Speaking of meaningful work, I have an update on your family's situation." Over the past 18 months, the legal and personal fallout had played out exactly as Theodore had predicted. My parents had attempted to contest the will changes, hiring expensive lawyers with money they'd borrowed against their remaining assets. The legal challenges had failed spectacularly when the documented evidence of their psychological manipulation became part of the court record. Garrett's medical practice had finally collapsed under the weight of multiple investigations. He'd lost his license and was now working as a medical consultant for insurance companies, a job that paid roughly a tenth of what he'd previously earned. Victoria's interior design business had folded entirely, and she'd taken a position with a mid-range furniture store. Damien's law firm had imploded after the sexual harassment scandal expanded to include accusations of financial impropriety. He was currently fighting disbarment proceedings while working as a paralegal for a personal injury attorney. Your parents sold the house in Millbrook Heights last month. They've moved to a 2-bedroom apartment in Riverside District, ironically about 6 blocks from where you used to live. How are they handling it? Not well. Your mother called my attorney last week asking if there was any way to renegotiate the family arrangements. She seems to believe that enough time has passed for everyone to forgive and forget. I wasn't surprised. Throughout the legal proceedings, various family members had attempted reconciliation approaches, usually timed to coincide with their latest financial difficulties. Each attempt had been carefully worded to minimize their responsibility while maximizing my obligation to provide assistance. And Natasha? Theodore's expression darkened slightly. That's more complicated. She's moved back from Colorado and has been asking mutual acquaintances about rebuilding her relationship with Riley. But my sources tell me that she's also been meeting with a literary agent about writing a book. A book about what? About growing up in a dysfunctional, wealthy family and finding redemption through honest relationships. Apparently, she wants to position herself as the family member who saw the truth and tried to help. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Even Natasha, who'd seemed genuinely remorseful about her participation in the family's psychological warfare, was ultimately looking for ways to profit from the situation. Let me guess. She wants to interview me for this book? She's requested a meeting through 3 different intermediaries, says she wants to tell the real story and make sure your voice is heard. Hard pass. My voice has been heard plenty, and I'm not interested in being anyone's redemption narrative. Theodore nodded approvingly. I told them you'd say that. But there's something else. Judge Morrison mentioned that Garrett has been asking around about military records, specifically about access to classified information regarding your service record. That caught my attention immediately. Military service records contained sensitive information about operations, locations, and personnel. If Garrett was trying to access classified materials, it could indicate a much more serious problem than simple financial desperation. I'll make some calls, I said, already mentally cataloging which of my military contacts could help monitor any attempts to breach my service records. There's one more thing, Riley. Something positive. He pulled out an official-looking letter. It's from the Department of Defense. I opened the letter carefully, scanning the formal language until I reached the key paragraph. Then I read it again to make sure I understood correctly. They're offering me a position as a civilian consultant for special operations planning, based on my unique combination of field experience and executive leadership skills. A position that would allow you to continue serving your country while running Thornfield Enterprises? It's perfect for you. He was right. The offer represented everything I'd worked toward, the ability to use my military expertise in service of national security while building something meaningful in the private sector. It was validation of both sides of my identity, military and civilian. There's something poetic about this, I mused. My family spent years trying to convince me I had no direction, no real career prospects. Now I have opportunities they could never have imagined. Success is the best revenge, Theodore agreed. But more than that, happiness is the best revenge. And you look genuinely happy for the first time in years. He was right about that, too. The constant background anxiety I'd carried throughout my 20s, the nagging worry that maybe my family was right about my failures, had completely disappeared. In its place was a calm confidence that came from knowing exactly who I was and what I was capable of achieving. Grandpa, can I ask you something? Do you ever regret how dramatically you changed the family dynamics that night? Theodore considered the question seriously. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that I didn't see what was happening sooner. But I don't regret the decision itself. You needed someone to recognize your worth, and they needed to face consequences for their actions. Even though it essentially destroyed the family?
Riley, what we had wasn't a family. It was a hierarchy based on maintaining appearances and keeping certain people in subordinate positions. What we have now is more honest. As evening approached, I prepared to leave the office. Tomorrow, I had a video conference with Pentagon officials about the consulting position. Next week, I was flying to San Diego to personally oversee the opening of our West Coast office. The following month, I'd be giving the keynote address at a national conference on veteran entrepreneurship. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Riley, this is your mother. I know you probably won't respond, but I want you to know that your father and I are proud of what you've accomplished. We realize now that we were wrong about everything. If you ever want to talk, we're here. I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. Some bridges, once burned, were better left as ashes. Some relationships, once poisoned, were healthier when ended. I'd learned that forgiveness didn't require reconciliation, and healing didn't require maintaining toxic connections. The strongest thing I'd ever done wasn't surviving their psychological manipulation. It was choosing to build a life that didn't need their approval to validate its worth. As I walked to my car in the executive parking garage, I thought about the young woman who'd sat through years of family dinners believing she was the failure they told her she was. That woman felt like a stranger to me now, someone I remembered with compassion, but no longer identified with. The woman I'd become had built something extraordinary from the ashes of their attempts to diminish her. And tomorrow, she was going to keep building. Because that's what real strength looked like. Not just surviving the attempts to break you, but thriving so completely that their opinion becomes irrelevant. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all.